Dr. Maggie Bryson. In this video, we're going to get started learning Middle Egyptian. The only textbook you'll need at this stage is Henry Fisher's Egyptian Calligraphy. It describes and illustrates the hieroglyphic signs that we're going to be learning, and it shows you simplified ways to draw them for yourself. You can download it for free from the Giza Archives website. Other than that, all you'll need is a notebook, some pens or pencils, and a willingness to learn. Learning ancient Egyptian can seem challenging at first. It's very different from English, and you have to learn at least one new writing system in order to read it. Nevertheless, I think that if we work step by step, you'll find that it's not so hard after all. I'm very confident that with a little patience and some hard work, you'll be able to read simple hieroglyphic inscriptions in no time. We're going to begin our study of Middle Egyptian by talking about the hieroglyphic writing system. Hieroglyphs are simply the pictures of people and animals, clothes, food, and all sorts of other things that the ancient Egyptians used to represent the ideas and sounds of their language. Our word hieroglyph comes from two Greek words that mean sacred and to carve. The idea of hieroglyphs as sacred carvings isn't actually too far from how the ancient Egyptians themselves thought of them. In ancient Egyptian, hieroglyphs were called medu necher, which means the words of the gods. In general, the ancient Egyptians used hieroglyphs to write down texts that they thought were so important that they needed to be preserved on a permanent basis. In practice, this usually meant texts that had religious content or some kind of religious purpose. Inscriptions on temple walls, for instance, or texts in tombs that were designed to help the deceased live on in the afterlife forever. Hieroglyphs were also used to record the deeds of kings and officials. This was not only for the benefit of posterity, but also for the benefit of the gods, who were thought to be happiest when they knew that every member of Egyptian society was fulfilling his or her duties and responsibilities correctly. Because hieroglyphic inscriptions were meant to be permanent, we usually find them on durable surfaces, carved, for instance, into stone walls or statues, or painted on wood or plaster. Hieroglyphs were sometimes written on papyrus or other portable materials, but in general, they were intended to be durable. The ancient Egyptians had another writing system for everyday texts that were meant to be used and handled. We call this hieratic. It was a cursive script derived from hieroglyphs, and it was usually written on papyrus in ink with a reed pen, or on ostraca, which are fragments of limestone or pottery that the ancient Egyptians used much the same way you or I would use ordinary writing paper. As you can see, hieratic can be fairly challenging to read. For that reason, we're going to stick for the time being to hieroglyphs. Before we get started learning the individual hieroglyphic signs, I think it's worthwhile to stop for a moment and talk about the hieroglyphic writing system in general, what it is and how it works. Actually, it might be best to start by talking about what it isn't. It isn't an alphabet like the one that we use to write English. An alphabet is a very specific kind of writing system, one in which every sign, which we can also call characters or letters, represents one of the basic sounds of that language. No sign ever represents more than one sound at the same time, and there are no signs that represent anything other than sounds. Unlike the letters of an alphabet, hieroglyphic signs can do several different things. They can serve, for instance, as logograms. A logogram is a single sign that by itself represents an entire word. Let's take as an example this sign, which is an image, simplified, of a house. As you might expect, this sign can represent the Egyptian word for house, which we pronounce as per. We don't actually know much about how the ancient Egyptian language sounded, and we'll get back to that problem in a little bit. For now, though, let's just suffice it to say that when we see this sign and it's serving as a logogram, we read it per and understand that it means house. Another way that hieroglyphs could function is as what we call phonograms. A phonogram is a sign that represents a sound or a combination of sounds. In the example of the house sign, because the ancient Egyptian word for house is per, in other words that contain that same group of sounds in that order, the ancient Egyptians could use the sign even if the meaning of the word didn't have anything to do with houses. For instance, the word peri is a verb that means to emerge. It's written with the house sign to represent the sounds per. A final way that hieroglyphic signs can be used is as determinatives. A determinative is simply a sign that's added to a word to show what category of thing it belongs to. When a sign is used as a determinative, it doesn't have a sound value, which just means that we don't pronounce it when we read the word. In the case of the house sign, it can be added to show that a word belongs to the category of buildings or parts of buildings. Let's look at the word that we pronounce ot. The sounds ot are represented by the arm sign and the half circle sign, which is actually a loaf of bread. The house sign at the end just represents the category of thing to which a room belongs, buildings or parts of buildings. Determinatives might not seem that useful on the face of it, but if you think about the fact that languages often have words that sound very similar but have different meanings, a determinative begins to make sense. Raising the issue of words with similar sounds but different meanings brings us back to the issue of ancient Egyptian phonology, that is, how the language was pronounced. We know frustratingly little about how ancient Egyptian actually sounded. The hieroglyphic writing system only represents consonants. When I told you that we pronounced the ancient Egyptian word for house, per, in fact, all we know is that the word contained the consonants P and R in that order. The E sound is just something that Egyptologists add to make it easier to read words out loud or talk about them amongst ourselves. It would be very hard to say per, which is what's actually written, so we say per. For some consonants, we add an A after them, but usually we just put an E in between the consonants because we don't have a good way of evaluating what the vowels would actually have been. What we do know about the phonology, the sounds of ancient Egyptian, comes from a couple of different sources. The last phase of the language, which we call Coptic, has survived as the liturgical or church language of Egyptian Christians. Because most Coptic words have ancient Egyptian ancestors, and the consonants in a language tend to change comparatively little over time, we can often reconstruct the consonants that were in an ancient Egyptian word from its Coptic descendant. Sometimes we have cases in which an ancient Egyptian word was written in another ancient language for which we have a better understanding of its phonetic structure. A good example of this is the case of the Amarna letters. Many Egyptian names, in particular, are written in the Mesopotamian language Akkadian in the Amarna letters. Because we know the vowel sounds of Akkadian, we can sometimes get the vowel sounds of the Egyptian words through their Akkadian equivalents, but we have so few Akkadian representations of Egyptian words that we can't fill in all the blanks this way. As for the consonants of the ancient Egyptian language, we'll talk about how we think they were pronounced as we begin to learn the hieroglyphic signs. When it comes to the vowels, I'm afraid we're just going to have to stick to the convention of using the letter E in between consonants in most cases. A final issue that we should talk about before we get started learning the individual hieroglyphic signs is transliteration. Transliteration is simply taking an ancient Egyptian text written in hieroglyphs and using a simplified writing system based on our own alphabet to represent the sounds of the words. There were about 750 hieroglyphic characters in use in Egypt between 2000 and 1000 BC. It's much easier when we want to write about an ancient Egyptian text to be able to represent it in a simplified manner using characters that are much fewer in number and more familiar to us. What we call the transliteration alphabet consists mostly of letters from our Roman alphabet with a few added to represent sounds that don't exist in English. I'll give you an example here of how the transliteration alphabet works, using my own name. My name, of course, is written in the Roman alphabet, but it uses 6 letters to represent 4 sounds. M-A-G-G-I-E to represent M, A, G, and E. We would use 4 letters from the transliteration alphabet to write my name. An M, this letter that looks like a 3, but which we call an aleph, and which represents the sound A, a G, and an I with a funny dot on the top. An important reason why we transliterate is because a number of hieroglyphic signs could represent the same sound in the ancient Egyptian language. When we want to organize ancient Egyptian words into, say, a dictionary, it helps to have a way to represent them phonetically, using a reduced number of signs. Our transliteration alphabet is not in the same order as the Roman alphabet that we use to write English. It's important to memorize the transliteration alphabet in the order in which it's given here, reading each row from left to right, and then reading the row below it. This is so that when the time comes, you'll be able to look up ancient Egyptian words in a dictionary. I remember when I was first learning Middle Egyptian, I would walk around campus reciting the transliteration out loud in order. I think people must have thought I was a little bit strange, but memorization is so important when you're learning a foreign language. We come up with all kinds of funny strategies to help ourselves remember the things that we need to know. To me, these funny little habits are a big part of the fun of learning a language. And memorization is extremely important. It may seem kind of like a pain in the neck, but it's something that you really need to do. A wonderful Egyptologist that I once had classes with always used to say that it's very important to keep the details and facts on your hard drive so that the rest of your mind is free to think the big thoughts. It might not hurt to pause the video here and copy out this transliteration alphabet into your notebook so that you can start learning it in the right order. Some of the signs are unfamiliar to you. They're not part of the Roman alphabet. They represent sounds that we don't have in English. And don't worry, we'll talk about each one as we come to the hieroglyphic sign that goes with it.